This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to the River Management Roundtable, talking about the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir forecasting and planning. My name is Risa Shimoda with the River Management Society, and we welcome you to one of the two River Management Roundtables we have each month. On the second Tuesday of the month, the first of the two that we do monthly, we talk about on the river topics, which, like the one today, more operational in nature and more kind of nuts and bolts with what river managers, water trail leaders and directors and watershed managers do on kind of on a daily basis to manage the river in a wise and healthy way. Folks are state river managers. These probably include you guys who are here today. Planners, watershed leaders, water trail directors, partnership wild and scenic river leads, outfitters, and we might see a student or two. And all are welcome. These are all free. And then the second one of the month, the workplace culture sessions, we always talk about more social interaction, workplace dynamics, and sometimes we'll extend into topics like that we have in the past few months about thinking about relationships of those who all must share the river. So you're welcome anytime, and thanks for registering and showing up. So we'll hear in a second from our guest person, Reggie Walters. And I introduced myself, and with me are Angie Furman, the River Training Center Coordinator. There's Angie, and also Becca Price, our Communications Coordinator, who you'll see from time to time and posts all of our website stuff and social media and emails from RMS. So Reggie, I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay, thanks, Risa. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. All right, and I trust that everyone can see my title slide there. Hetch Hetchy Reservoir Forecasting and Planning.
Looks great.
Good.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Reggie Walters, and as mentioned, I work with Hetch Hetchy Water and Power. I'm a hydrologist. I've been here for about the past 4 years. And yeah, today I'm going to give you a talk about how we operate this reservoir and kind of give you a behind the scenes look at some of the data and the forecasting methods and techniques that are in use. So before I start, I just want to give a shout out to my working group. So I'm part of what's called the Water and Power Planning Group here at Hetch Hetchy. It's a small group. The immediate members include Chris, Nick, and Harrison, and myself. And the work I'll show today is not just my own, but a collaborative effort from the four of us. So while we spend the vast majority of our time behind the computer screen at the desk, from time to time, when we do get to go into the field, we get to go to some pretty amazing places together. So I think I speak on behalf of the group when I say that we all have a pretty awesome job. So today's talk will sort of focus around these 4 bullet points. I'll focus most of the time on the last one. I'm going to try to cram in a lot of slides, so I might jump quickly through a few of them. But if you miss anything, hopefully you can ask questions at the end. So first of all, I'll talk about the Hetch Hetchy Regional Water System, some of the infrastructure, facilities, and the history very briefly. And then I'll talk about the water demands and flow statistics on the river. So we work on the Tuolumne River. If you're not familiar, it's in Central California. I'll show a map here momentarily. And then I'll discuss our management objectives, of which there are a handful, and how sometimes one can take priority or the other, and they can sometimes be at odds with one another. But the various objectives that we are sort of held to for reservoir operations. And then lastly, data collection and modeling and forecasting. And that's where I'll kind of geek out on some of the analysis and projections that our group does. So before I start, I'm just going to go over a few units. So when we talk about volumes, and I apologize if this is redundant for a lot of you, I'm sure it is, but when we talk about volumes in a reservoir, we're usually using the unit of acre feet. So just an acre over the landscape, 1 foot deep. And our reservoirs are large enough that we typically will talk about them in terms of thousands of acre feet. And you'll see me abbreviate that here with the acronym TAF. So if you see that 1,000 acre feet, it's about 326 million gallons in 1 TAF. Stream flow, cubic feet per second, that's about 35 CFS is about 1 cubic meter per second for folks who prefer the metric system. And 1 cubic feet per second flowing at a constant rate over the course of 24 hours will yield about 2 acre feet. So 1 CFS is 1.98 acre feet per day. And then lastly, just to make it a little more confusing, pipelines, when our water enters a pipeline, we usually discuss it in units of millions of gallons per day. So 1 MGD is about 1.5 CFS. So here's kind of a 10,000 foot view of our system and where it's sort of situated, here in Central California. So we divert water off the Tuolumne River, which originates in the high country in Yosemite National Park. So the entire watershed above our main storage reservoir, Hetch Hetchy, is within the bounds of Yosemite. And it's, of course, in a high mountainous area in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's in a snow-dominated region. And there's a pretty large elevation gradient between those mountains and even the reservoir to the San Francisco Bay Area, where we ultimately deliver water and power through a series of tunnels and pipelines. And we're able to deliver that water across the Central Valley of California, all via gravity, which saves us a huge amount of energy and costs for pumping. So we deliver water to some 2.6 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as other facilities along the transmission pathway. So outside of the actual city and county of San Francisco on the peninsula, we have a large number of customers and users that are divided up into various districts that comprise what's called the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Association. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but they are situated around the east and west bays, particularly the south and west bays of San Francisco. So I'm kind of zooming in now on aerial imagery, looking at the reservoir system. So over there on the right, you can see Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. That's our main storage reservoir. We also operate 2 other reservoirs, Lake Eleanor, which is also inside Yosemite National Park, and then Cherry Reservoir, which is just outside the park and inside the Stanislaus National Forest. And these are all on the Tuolumne River or Tuolumne River tributaries. And then down here on the left, the lower left, Don Pedro Reservoir is a big rim reservoir on the Tuolumne River that we do not operate. That is operated by the Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts. So we work closely with the folks there. That's the biggest reservoir on the system, on the river. And we're in pretty constant communication with those folks as to our operations as well as theirs. And then Moccasin is a little town just off an arm of Don Pedro Reservoir, where we have some offices and a powerhouse, and is where I'm speaking to you from today. So kind of in the lower foothills of the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. So just to kind of tie in some infrastructure, how it's all tied together, just briefly on the Cherry Reservoir side, this white line here shows an outline of where the Cherry Power Tunnel is located. So we have a power tunnel connecting Cherry Reservoir to a powerhouse called Home Powerhouse. And Home Powerhouse is actually where throughout the summer season, we traditionally have made recreational releases at certain hours of the day to provide adequate flows for floating, rafting, and kayaking on the Tuolumne River, wild and scenic stretch between there and near Don Pedro. So it is a very popular river for recreation in the summertime, and the majority of those releases, when flows are naturally quite low, are sustained through home powerhouse. Today I'm going to focus more so on the Hetch Hetchy side of our operations. So in the yellow line is what we call the Hetchy side. So Hetch Hetchy Reservoir is connected initially for its diversions to a powerhouse called Kirkwood, and that water flows through a tunnel called Canyon Power Tunnel, and it's just an unlined tunnel through granite bedrock, connects to Kirkwood Powerhouse, and any water we're diverting for the city will pass through Kirkwood Powerhouse first. And we can actually generate more hydropower at Kirkwood than we need to divert for water deliveries. And in some cases, we will spill some water at Kirkwood back into the Tuolumne River. So I didn't mention this, but Kirkwood House sits right on the banks of the Tuolumne. So we can spill some excess water into the Tuolumne, and then the remaining water will stay in a tunnel called the Mountain Tunnel and continue downstream to a small pool called Priest Reservoir, which sits just above Moccasin, and then flows down another series of pipes to Moccasin Powerhouse. And we have a small reservoir called Moccasin Reservoir. And again, we can spill some additional water out of Moccasin back into Don Pedro Reservoir. And then we'll basically set our valves and our gates at Moccasin such that we maintain a constant supply of water into what we call the Foothill Tunnel and the San Joaquin Pipeline, which is the pipeline that will ultimately bring water through the Central Valley and the Coast Range and over to the San Francisco Bay Area. So zooming back out, here's what it looks like. Our system, in terms of the number of sort of pipes and turnouts, is actually fairly simple compared to what we call the local system. So my sort of area of focus is generally inside this red box. Hetch Hetchy Water and Power, we're actually responsible all the way up to the Coast Range Tunnel. But the entire SFPUC, or San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, who is ultimately our employer, this is our service area, so it's actually quite large. But we're really focusing, and my efforts are really focused on this upper right hand side of the diagram, and then the watersheds beyond there. So a little history about Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, and this will be very brief. It is impounded by O'Shaughnessy Dam, which was built in 2 stages, the first of which was completed in 1923, and then the second in 1938. And it impounds, in its current configuration or current size, is 360,000 acre-feet of storage. And it is our primary water supply reservoir, so that's its primary purpose. Any additional power generation is completely secondary, so we will never make discretionary power generation with water that could be stored for water supply from this reservoir. It is, as mentioned, within the national park, and we do have the unique benefit of having a filtration avoidance permit. So the water is of exceptional quality, and we do not have to filter water that leaves the reservoir and goes directly to the taps in San Francisco. So that also saves us a lot of filtration costs and energy. So here is what the dam looked like in 1923 after the first stage of completion. I'll have you note there's this kind of square deck in the middle of the dam. And if you keep that in mind when you're looking at an image of the current shape of the dam, that deck is basically the floor of this valve house. That's this big box here where the water is coming out these uppermost valves on the face of the dam. So it was lifted about 80 or 85 feet in the second stage of completion. And so as you can see, we have valves on the face of the dam. There's 8 of them that we can make releases directly to the Tuolumne River during during runoff. Then we have a couple other smaller valves just around the corner from here that will make some of our smaller releases during the later season and during the dry part of the year. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the flow stats on the river and our diversion, our water demands. So Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, as mentioned, it's got a capacity of 360,000 acre feet, which is about 117 billion gallons. So it's quite large. It's enough to produce deliveries to the city for a year without any inflows, and then some. But the average inflows are actually well beyond the storage capacity. So average inflows to the river, or excuse me, to the reservoir are about 750,000 acre feet. So that means on an average year, we have enough water to fill the lake, fill the reservoir from empty twice over, and then some. And our average deliveries to the city are about 250,000 acre feet. So the difference being the releases on average to the Tuolumne of about 500,000 acre feet, which means it's a very actively managed reservoir. Even in a below average year, we're releasing a ton of water to manage the inflows that we see into this reservoir. Here at the left is a map just showing, I'm actually showing some snow depth imagery, and I'll talk more about that later. But these are the watershed delineations for Hetch Hetchy at the far right. Then Lake Eleanor watershed is actually sandwiched in between Hetch Hetchy and Cherry Reservoir, or Cherry watershed, which is the farthest left black outline delineation. And the watershed is just the point above a section or a point on the river above which any drop of water, barring any losses to evaporation or to the groundwater system, will eventually flow into the channel and past that point. So Hetch Hetchy has a watershed area, contributing area of about 290,000 acres. It's about 450 square miles. It's quite a lot larger than Cherry and Eleanor watersheds. And it spans a pretty tremendous elevation gradient. So from 4,000 or even a little below 4,000, the reservoir itself is closer to 3,800 feet when it's full. And the top of the watershed is 13,000 feet in elevation. So the highest points in Yosemite are in the kind of southeast portion of this watershed near a point called Mount Lyell, where in an average year, there'd be a lot of snow accumulation up there. And due to its elevation, it tends to run off relatively late in the season, which is great for our water supply. So management objectives. We have a handful of management objectives that we are responsible for adhering to. And here they are kind of just spelled out. So some of them are pretty obvious. The first one, to operate our dams safely. So we have people and infrastructure downstream of O'Shaughnessy Dam. So, it's really important to operate the dam and the reservoir as safely as possible. And that means, not letting the lake be too high during times where there might be really high inflows, because our spillway has a limited capacity and our outlet works have a limited capacity. And we don't want to spill too much water. And we certainly don't want to go into a situation where we're releasing uncontrolled amounts of water over our spillway. So it's important to always be looking ahead and running the dams as safely as we can. Number two, we're always meeting our regulatory stream release requirements. So say when it's drier, we'll probably just be meeting or slightly exceeding our stream release requirements. And those are set forth through agreements with the Department of the Interior, and they vary based on the time of year and on the type of year we're having. For instance, right now our minimum stream flow release is about 145 CFS from the reservoir directly to the river. And so we're always meeting or exceeding those flow rates. Number three, we're always delivering or sustaining our water deliveries to the city and county of San Francisco and the customers. And basically meeting whatever the current demand rate is. And again, we'll change our diversion rate different times throughout the year, depending on what the local demand is. Number 4, which can often be at odds with number 1, is to maximize storage. This one's huge. So when there's a big storm coming in, we sometimes have to release water to maintain space for projected inflows. But at the end of a storm event, we certainly want to capture some water if needed, especially in a dry year. So our goal is to maximize storage. And then during snowmelt runoff, that's absolutely crucial. And our group's sort of number 1 task with snowmelt runoff is to maximize storage such that we achieve a sort of configuration like what you're seeing on the photo at the right here, which is showing the reservoir full and spilling over the drum gates in the spillway, which is what you're seeing in the image. So we have these 3 drum gates in 3 unique bays that will actually, they're hydraulically controlled, and they'll lift up with the water elevation when we're allowed to do so, and we will spill over the top of them, ideally right when the snowmelt runoff is starting to recede, so that we can sort of safely bring it up to maximize storage. And then once we have it full and spilling, we'll slowly start to decrease our releases to just baseline flow rates to meet number 2 and meet number 3 on this list here. And then we'll slowly, as slowly as possible, start to draft the reservoir down going into the dry season. So at number 5, we try to optimize power generation. So while the reservoir is on its way up in the springtime and various points throughout the winter, we might generate excess power generation if we're confident that the water supply is available to do so. And that's something we're always working on projecting. And excess power generation helps us defray some of our costs for operating. And then, of course, last but not least, with environmental releases, there's often additional water supply to make releases in excess of our minimum stream flow requirements. And what we do is we work with various stakeholders, including the Park Service, to optimize those releases to offset some of our impacts downstream, or to help optimize for ecological benefits downstream of the reservoir. And I'll touch on that towards the end of the talk. So what's crucial for getting at all of this, all these objectives, and what is effectively a holy grail in hydrology, is having information about the timing and the volume of stream flow. If you ask anybody in hydrology what information they need, particularly water managers, this is exactly what everybody wants, and it's what we're always trying to project and estimate. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to kind of focus on how we try to do that in order to meet our objectives as best as we can. So first of all, to make a forecast or to run a model, we have to collect data, and that is a huge part of our job, is collecting data about what's going on out there in the watershed. So these are just a list of some of the variables that we're interested in collecting information about. So snow depth is a huge one. Excuse me. Snow water equivalent is perhaps the most important variable that we try to measure and describe. So if you're not familiar with that term, SWE, S-W-E, it's just the depth of water that would be left behind if you melted a snowpack. So for instance, with a spring snowpack of say a foot in depth, by the time it's melted down, it'll often leave behind something like 5 inches of water, for example. So snow water equivalent is really important, as is precipitation. We have various precipitation buckets out in the field. Some of them have different mechanisms for measuring the precip rates and totals. Air temperature, of course, is important. Solar radiation, wind speed, and relative humidity are also very important. So we're monitoring these things at various locations. So for starters, let's look at where we measure snow. So there's the three watersheds again at the right, delineated in blue. And then we have a handful of what we call snow pillows, and then we have a bunch of snow courses. Those are marked with the white and red bubbles respectively. So we have about 18 snow surveys or snow courses that we gather information about. Some of them we actually perform ourselves. Others are performed by other cooperating agencies, including the Park Service and Pacific Gas and Electric. And so we're always looking at, how much snow water equivalent is out there in the basins. So if you're not familiar with the snow pillow, this is what one looks like. This is at a location called Horse Meadow. And they're just like they sound, they're a pillow on the ground. They're basically propylene glycol encased in aluminum, and it's spread out over a surface area and usually covered with some earthen material. And into an end of the pillow is a pressure transducer that's basically plumbed in there, and it senses pressure differential. And as you accumulate a snowpack above that pillow, it'll read out in inches of water content. So that gives us at one point in space water content, and we can hook that sensor up to a data logger and a radio and send that signal out. So usually once an hour, we'll get an update as to what the snow water content is if the pillow is working. Snow courses. Sometimes snow pillows have a snow course nearby. Other times they're in unique locations. So for instance, here is the map for the Dana Meadows snow course. So every snow course has a unique map, and they are at a fixed location in space. There's usually a sign between a couple of trees or between a couple of signposts. And folks have been going out to these locations, in some cases dating back to the 1930s, and measuring at the same places. So most of our snow courses have 10 holes that are measured per site, and they're usually spaced somewhere between 50 and a couple hundred feet apart. And you take a tape measure out there and poke holes in the snow and read out snow depth and the snow water equivalent, and contribute to this pretty impressive historical data record. So here's what it looks like. There's a couple folks here. This is a gentleman from the National Park Service on the left, and an engineer with the city of San Francisco on the right, taking a snow course measurement this April. And so you can see they've extracted their snow core, and they're measuring the weight of it. The scale that's being used is actually calibrated to read out in inches of water content. So for those 10 holes, we'll get water content and take an average, and that gives us a number to use for the water content at that particular snow course. And then what we'll do is we'll lump all that together and take averages of all the snow surveys that are performed. So the surveys are usually performed once a month from February through May. And so here, this plot is showing you the average snow course index, or just the average of all snow courses, as a function of the long-term normal. Those are plotted as the yellow stars on this plot. And then the red line is showing the average of all the snow pillows that we look at, or what we call our snow pillows index. And again, that's plotted as a function or as a percent of the sort of April 1st maximum from our long-term record. And so what you can see here is that by late December of this year, we were way above normal being the black line. And then this year, the moisture tap basically turned off at the beginning of the new calendar year, and snow kind of just sat out there, melted really slowly or compacted really slowly. And then we really saw a melt turn on during the late part of March. And then we did get a couple of storms, thankfully, during April this year, but we are significantly below average for about the third year in a row here. So anyway, this is a really important metric that we look at, is the snow pillows index and the snow courses index, and all this data goes into various models or model calibrations that we use to project what might be coming down the road. So moving on, we also look at other locations aside from the snow pillows that are collecting weather information. So this is just a plot showing the Hetch Hetchy watershed and a handful of weather stations that we pull data from. And we'll pull things like air temperature and precip and try to interpolate between all these stations to come up with a gridded product for what we expect the sort of aerial average temperature or precipitation to be on any given day. Another tool that we are starting to use a lot more is called the Airborne Snow Observatory, or the ASO. And this is a really powerful tool that is actually a spin-off from a NASA JPL pilot project. It was actually piloted in the Tuolumne, so we are very fortunate to have quite a bit of data from this operation. So if you're not familiar with it, how it works is the ASO is actually an aircraft, an airborne, as the name implies, product where they mount a LiDAR laser scanning instrument on the bottom of an airplane and shoot it down at the ground surface. And what they'll do is they'll fly during the summertime and get sort of a bare earth image or elevation of what at really high resolution, what the elevation of the land surface is without any snow on it. And then they'll go back at various times in the winter, if we're lucky, and they will shoot the laser again with really high precision GPS and altimetry readouts. And what it returns is basically a difference map. And that difference map is indicative of the snow depth on the ground. And we get these really cool maps at really high spatial resolution that look like this. And so not only do we get snow depth from them, but they actually run a state-of-the-art model to predict the snow density. And if you multiply snow depth by snow density, you get snow water equivalent. And so instead of getting snow water equivalent from snow courses at a handful, a couple of dozen sites once a month from an ASO flight, we might only get one or two a year, but it gives us millions of data points. And we're only just kind of scratching the surface with how to use this data. But by now, we are in our 10th year of collecting data from the ASO, and it's turning into a real wealth of data for the Tuolumne River Basin and various other basins in California and outside of California now. But it's really cool because we get a basin SWE, or basin snow water content volume estimate in thousands of acre feet above all of our reservoirs. So it's a really powerful tool, and I'll touch more on how we're using it over the next few minutes. So just as a demonstration, this is from water year 2014. So what I'm showing on the black line is our snow pillows index. So the average of all our snow pillows plotted in black as a percent of April 1st median. And what we see is that we peaked somewhere in early March, and then the snowpack started to melt. And according to the snow pillows index, we were melted out by about the middle or late part of April. And if that's all the information we had, if we weren't looking at anything else, we would assume, okay, the snow is gone. We probably can't expect any more inflows into Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. But then what we see with the ASO is this revealing sort of image of how much snow there is still left up in the basin. So these red bars or orange bars are showing how much water content above Hetch Hetchy the ASO measured. So you can see that even in early May, there was perhaps more than 100,000 acre feet of snow water content sitting above Hetch Hetchy after our pillows had already indicated complete meltout. So, our highest pillow might be limited to 9 or 10,000 feet, but the ASO is measuring that snow that's still sitting up there at 11, 12, and 13,000 feet, and helping potentially inform our operations for how much water might still be coming down the hill. So how do we use all this data to not just say something about what the current state of the system is, but look forward in time to produce forecasts and projections? So we have a handful of forecast products. They can be as simple as regression estimates, where we look at historical snow measurements and compare them to historical runoff. Now with ASO, we can look at ASO snow measurements versus historical runoff. We have a statistical runoff model that we run in-house. Ours is called the Water Supply Forecast Model, WSFM. The State Department of Water Resources also runs some statistical runoff models that we compare our results with. And then last bullet point here, we have these physics and process-based runoff models that sort of try to describe the watershed in a more realistic sense. And we can run those deterministically, say with a weather forecast, or we'll run them in an ensemble form, which I'll kind of describe after a few slides here. So here's a look at what a regression estimate might look like. This is on the left, just showing a scatter plot between May 1st snow surveys from the current water year on the x-axis against some historical May 1st snow surveys on the y-axis. And we can just search for, this whole period of record, which years had the best correlation to the current one. And so, for instance, this year we were most correlated with water year 1994. And then we can look at, well, how much runoff did we get in water year 1994 into Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is shown on the right. So just cumulative runoff in those thick lines for the years that were most sort of correlated to the current one. And that just gives us kind of a starting point. Okay, here's what we saw in those years. The conditions might have been a little different hydrologically, but in terms of snowpack, here's what we saw. And it kind of gives a starting point. And these were all below average years, which makes sense because our snow course and snow pillows index tell us the same. We can do the same thing with ASO. And what we find is that if we plot ASO snow water content above Hetch Hetchy, which is on the x-axis in this figure, and we compare it to the inflow that was measured from the date of the ASO flight through the rest of the runoff season, we get a pretty darn tight fit around the 1-to-1 line, indicating that ASO is offering a really powerful estimate for how much water we might expect coming into the reservoir. Our WSFM tool, again, this is our statistically based runoff model. This one informs our sort of long-term operations, and we issue forecasts with this tool at a handful of times throughout the water year. So, excuse me. Each one of the black diamonds in this figure represents a forecast for April through July runoff into Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And so you can see that, for instance, on, say, January 1st, we had a median forecast of somewhere on the order of 650,000 acre feet. But our uncertainty range, which is represented by the red up and down arrows, is really high because, in January, if you're asking someone what the weather's going to be like by April and beyond, they're going to say, well, it could be really wet or it could be really dry. It might be really hot or it might be really cold. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty. But as we march forward in time, so that uncertainty band, as you might expect, starts to decrease and leads to what some might call a funnel plot or a funnel diagram of a forecast. So you can see that as this year's dry conditions kind of unfolded, we start to hone in on a below average runoff expectation. And so the magenta line is showing what we've gotten so far since April 1st. It's a little over 100,000 acre feet. And our model is telling us that at the dry end, we can probably expect maybe a couple hundred more before it's all said and done. Then we can use results from models like this to make projections. So on the left here is just a plot of projections for Hetch Hetchy Reservoir storage. So this is indicating that, hey, we might be full here in June and maybe full or just below full in July, and then starting to draw down based on different probability levels. So we're always talking about probabilities in hydrology and reservoir operations because we don't have one deterministic outcome to look at. We have the sort of spread of possible future outcomes. But from projections like this, we can develop likelihoods for, say, power generation, which is this table at the right. And don't worry about the numbers or anything, but just kind of as an example. And we can look also at Hetch Hetchy Reservoir spill volumes and the associated probabilities. So this is going to say, all right, with maximum power generation and meeting all of our deliveries and our stream flow releases, how much excess water do we have? And this starts to inform our decision making for how we can start to shape our environmental releases. So the last sort of modeling approach, and this is the one that is getting the most attention from us currently, and is sort of in the research and development stage in our group, is the physics or the process-based modeling approaches, where we try to physically describe what's happening out there in the landscape instead of just using statistics. And so we're running a model called the PRMS, or the Precipitation Runoff Modeling System, which is a USGS product, and we calibrated it over the Hetch Hetchy watershed, which is shown here at the left. And then we have all these various sub-watersheds where we divide the model up into, and we try to describe what's going on in each one of those. So we'll describe a snowpack in each little sub-watershed. We'll describe our estimate of what might be happening with evaporation and with the vegetation and the soils. And then ultimately, these all get routed together to produce a stream flow estimate at the reservoir. So here's what that looked like. Here's what that might look like in real time, where we'll run the model and it runs pretty efficiently. We can run it up to today's date. And what we'll do is we'll spin the model up and we'll try to estimate what are the conditions today? How much snow is out there? How much water is in the soils? How are the plants ready to turn on and start pulling water out of the soils? And at that point, we'll pause the model, and we'll just hit the pause button, and then we'll go out and say, all right, now that we have a picture of what the state of the system is, what does our weather forecast look like? Do we have some rain coming? Is it going to get warm, or do we have a low pressure system coming in that's going to cool things off for the next couple of weeks? And we can dump that weather forecast into the model and then produce a stream flow forecast. So, in this case, this is a forecast from 1 or 2 days ago for Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, and it's predicting, okay, your inflows are actually going to go down for a while because we're experiencing a low pressure trough moving through, and it's really freezing up some of that middle elevation snowpack. But then there's a projected warming trend later in the week and into the extended forecast, which is going to bring reservoir inflows back up, and we can expect our reservoir to start climbing as these inflows increase. And then let's say we want to project even longer into the future. So, let's say mid-May through the rest of the runoff season. It's hard to say much about what the weather is going to look like, but what we can do is start going back into our historical record and using resampling techniques to say, all right, after day 10 in our forecast, let's start using the weather data that we saw in, say, 1970 or 1990 or 1991 or 92. And we basically go resample from all of our historical weather data, and we build what's called an ensemble of forecasts. So here I'm actually showing you a product from the California Nevada River Forecast Center, or the CNRFC. So they actually produce, as a service to us, the forecasted reservoir inflows for Hetch Hetchy, and this is what it looks like as of a couple days ago. So again, we see this cool spell and then a warm up, and then there's a lot of uncertainty, but in general, inflows are going to start to subside as the season wears on. And then we can kind of just turn that on its side and look at the information in a different format, sort of cumulative reservoir inflows in acre feet. So again, we can see that We're going to start accumulating some reservoir inflows, and by mid-June, they're really going to level off because inflows in most of these outcomes are going to drop off pretty substantially. And we arrive at a median result of, somewhere in that range of 325,000 acre feet. And we can compare this to our other models, like our statistics model, and we start to arrive at hopefully similar solutions. So here I'm showing a very similar approach, but here I'm using that PRMS model that I mentioned that we are running in-house, and running it basically with, again, an ensemble of past weather data to see how our watershed might respond. And we've gotten to the point now where we can actually update that model along the way with data from the ASO. So for instance, we got an ASO flight in late April, and as we're running our model, it's describing what it thinks the snowpack is based on the weather data we're feeding it, but it's always going to be wrong. Every model is wrong, and what we can do is say, okay, well, you thought the snowpack was X on April 29th, but ASO, which we trust a little more because it's close to being an observation, we can actually say, okay, ASO saw Y amount of snowpack, and so we're going to update our model using a procedure called data assimilation, and we basically inject a new snow water content into the model, into every one of those little sub-watersheds, and then we keep running the model forward and let it play out. And again, we can compare that with our other results or other models. And just for instances, what we're seeing this year for cumulative inflows for April through July, our PRMS model that has that ASO update is very nicely agreeing in terms of total inflows with the CNRFC product. There might be some timing differences along the way, but they both arrive at a similar volume, which gives us a lot of confidence in using these products to inform our operations. So what ultimately we'll do with a tool like this or a product like this is to put it into another projection. And this is kind of a higher time resolution projection for what the reservoir might look like over the course of the next few months. And what we can do is kind of let the model play out and see if we can check all these boxes. These boxes are kind of indicative of those management objectives. So for instance, are we going to meet our water deliveries? Are we going to be able to produce additional power generation while there's adequate stream flow available? Do we refill the reservoir and maintain or maximize our water supply? And do we maintain that minimum stream flow release? And if we can check all these boxes, then what we're going to do next is say, all right, how much additional water do we have available in these scenarios? And it's going to be a range, and that range might look something like this. It might say, okay, you have something on the order of 25 to 50,000 acre feet of water at your disposal. And, if we didn't do something with this additional water, there's a chance that we wouldn't be operating our dam or our reservoir safely. So it's in our interest to release this water, and we're both satisfying our objective of safe reservoir operations, but also of optimizing our ecological or environmental releases. And so it's at that point that we're having this ongoing sort of discussion with what we call a discussion or a collaboration with the Upper Tuolumne River Ecosystem Program, or UTREP. And this is led by the SFPUC, but it's in close coordination with the Park Service and other stakeholders. And the UTREP program is helping to inform us how we might better shape these releases in order to produce maximum ecological benefits. So for example, this year, what we're going to try to do, and what we've done in past years, is try to inundate some of these wetlands downstream of O'Shaughnessy Dam. So for instance, this picture here is showing a valley called Pupino Valley just downstream of O'Shaughnessy. And through some modeling and observations from efforts of the UTREP program, we can see that at certain flow rates, we're able to inundate various wetlands or ponds that have been identified as areas of ecological diversity and of great importance by the Park Service and others. And so what the UTREP program will provide to us is template hydrographs that we can try to adhere to during these releases. And there's different template examples based on our projections for spill. So here's kind of just a look at this year's. We might be looking at something like this or something a little closer to this. So here's a 30,000 acre foot example versus a 40,000 acre foot example. And what we'll do is we'll try to hit about 4,000 CFS releases for several hours in order to fill that north pond from that image a couple slides ago. And then based on where our reservoir is and our projected inflows, we might drop to a lower flow bench to inundate another wetland area. And at some point we'll have to decrease our releases to top off the lake. But we'll try to do that in such a way that we minimize other unwanted impacts to other species. And so, we start to make projections like this, and it's a difficult balancing act, but we can run these models with these releases sort of programmed in and start to look at, okay, here is this sort of optimized release pattern that we might be looking at this year. And we're getting ready to do this basically over the next handful of days here. So it's pretty exciting times. So this is kind of a projection for what the reservoir and what the releases might look like over the course of the next couple of months with guidance from the UTREP team. Just looking back a few years ago now, our last sort of above average year was water year 2019. So here I'm just showing, the orange line is showing our Tuolumne below Hetch Hetchy releases. And the blue line shows the unimpaired flow or the inflows to the reservoir. So this particular year, we had a different shape. We had a lot more water to deal with in this particular scenario. But you can see that the guidance from UTREP allows us to, in some ways, mimic the natural hydrograph that would be on the river if it weren't for the existence of the dam. So, we try to help produce flows that are somewhat in accordance with what might be there if there were no dam. So just to close things out, I'm just going to discuss a few of the challenges that we see with our operations. The first of which is precipitation volatility. That can be either between years or during particular years. So for example, this year, this chart shows monthly precip. And as you can see, again, October and December were both huge. And then the tap turned off January, February, March, when we would expect to get a good majority of our annual precip. We got very little. In fact, this year we recorded 1.82 inches during January through March. The previous record for the driest January through March period was 4.6. So we basically blew that record apart. And there's been a handful of records like these that even in my brief tenure here have been broken. So we were always staying on our toes. Another one is earlier snow accumulation and snow melt. So the plot at the top is just kind of showing historical 10-station snow pillows index with a time window that starts in the late 90s in the dark color, and then kind of transitions to a more current index in the lighter colors. And as you can see, it kind of advances earlier in time, both in the accumulation and melt. And perhaps the most concerning plot is the one at the bottom, just showing kind of as we advance through the past few decades, we do see a sort of earlier melt out date of our snowpack. And just for the record, this isn't peer-reviewed work or anything. This is just kind of back of the envelope analyses, but we certainly have this signal in our snow data that we are seeing earlier and earlier snowpack disappearance, which potentially means lower reservoirs later in the year. We're also seeing model inconsistencies. So, for instance, last year, this is from water year 2021, about the same time a year ago, we were looking at forecasts for Hetch Hetchy that without ASO, we're saying, hey, you got something like 300 to 400,000 acre feet of water coming into your reservoir. But then we dumped ASO into the model and it said, oh, hold on a second, there's a lot less snow than your model thinks. We might be more like 230, 250,000 acre feet. And so that has one scratching their head when trying to communicate with managers and stakeholders. And in the end, the actual result we saw with the red line here was really close to what we saw with the ASO data. So a big part of this is just building trust in these state-of-the-art technologies and new forecast calibrations as time moves forward. It's kind of a slow process, but it's something we're always working on. Another challenge is just extreme weather events. Here's a forecast from October of this year where we saw at the tail end of a historic dry pattern some near record inflows to all of our reservoirs, particularly Cherry Reservoir, with an atmospheric river event that arrived kind of out of the blue, produced huge inflows and had us opening valves to safely operate Cherry during a time of year when we basically had, everything just minimized because the reservoir was so low. Suddenly to be bombarded with near record breaking inflows just keeps you on your toes constantly. So we're always looking for solutions and risk-based analyses. So for instance, we're developing tools for what we call a forecast-informed reservoir operations approach to operate our reservoirs, where every day of the year we're looking at forecasts and making sure that we can achieve the goals of safe operations while maximizing water supply. And then we're also looking at solutions for perhaps years that are going to be different than any years that we've seen in the past. So a lot of reservoir operations relies on using historical data to inform our current operations. Sometimes we have to be prepared for a drier year than we've ever seen before. So we're starting to run our models with assumptions that it might not ever rain again for the rest of this water year, and what is the projection for flows in that scenario. So that was a lot of information, but I just want to thank you all for your attention, and thanks again to the River Management Society for the invitation. Be happy to entertain questions, and if you'd like, you're welcome to email me at the email address here, rwalters@sfwater.org. Thank you.